Daddy's Little Anna, Chapter 16. Meeting Brian. I was still escaping from Bramerton whenever the opportunity presented itself, and sometimes I went to stay with Dad if he was out of jail at the time, because he put a lot of pressure on me to get back to him whenever I could. However, I was beginning to resent working on the block and handing the money over to him when I could just keep it for myself if he wasn't around. Anyway, I preferred meeting up with friends in town. There was a cafeteria where unemployed people used to sit smoking and making a cup of tea last all morning, and I met a few people there. When I was on the run from Brake or Bramerton, and if I wasn't with Dad or Kathy, I never really cared who I stayed with as long as they were friendly and there was plenty to drink or swallow. Most of the people I ended up staying with I would meet and bond with in pubs, while both of us were mellowed by alcohol. I was 15 when I met a guy called John, who let me stay for a few weeks at his place in the suburbs of the city. People who drink together are often generous in that way, like Dad used to be with friends such as Lucy. I never had sex with him. Since I was having sex with men for money and not enjoying it, I wasn't in a hurry to do it for nothing as well, unless I fancied myself to be in love. Not even for friends who were being generous with accommodation. I remember this guy had a bread van, and I used to go with him on his delivery rounds sometimes. I'd been there several weeks before he tried it on with me one night. I wasn't having any of that. I'd had enough of men wanting to have sex with me. What I wanted was friends I could have a laugh with who didn't want anything from me. So I stormed out of the house at about 6 in the morning, probably shouting something about that being all men ever wanted from me, and slamming the door after me. With self-esteem as near rock bottom as mine was in those days, it wasn't hard for people to offend me. I was always on the look for more evidence of how my position in the world was, and how little I should expect by way of respect from anyone. Having made my sad little moral stand, I was then without a place to stay, and I was walking down this road I didn't recognise as dawn broke. Unsure where I was going to go to next, I heard someone wolf whistling. Since there was no one else around, I could be pretty sure it was directed at me. I looked around for the culprit to give him a piece of my mind. The only person in view was a friendly-looking bearded man with dark hair, leaning over the balcony of his first-floor flat, grinning down at me. I must have recognised something good in him straight away, because I didn't give him an earful as I might have done in the circumstances, and we got talking. "Why don't you come up?" he suggested after a minute or two. Since I had no other plans and he seemed a congenial sort, I did. His name, I discovered, was Brian, and he was an Irish biker who'd been banned from driving and had to get rid of his bike, leaving him stranded in suburbia, just like me. He might have been without any wheels, but there was no doubting that he was still a biker in style and spirit. It turned out he was 35 years old, a full 20 years older than me. He was tall and slim and nice-looking, at least I thought so. His flat seemed to be full of people, some of them lodgers, some of them just friends passing through, who gradually stirred into life during the next few hours. All of them looking rumpled and hung over as they appeared from under blankets and inside sleeping bags. Brian was a bit of an artist, and he had painted a huge Motorhead score on the wall above the fireplace. It was an exact copy of the original fanged face created for the heavy metal rockers by an artist called Joe Pitango. Brian had surrounded it with his own twisting patterns of dragons and flames. There were more examples of his artwork on his body, and one of his arms was completely covered in tattoos that he'd designed himself. He had a rose on his neck, which wasn't like any tattoo I'd ever seen before. especially not the amateurish slashings I'd inflicted on my own body. Everything about Brian seemed to be a unique and interesting part of his personality. He also had a miniature Yorkshire Terrier called Motorhead Dick the Shit, or Dick for short. Dick was the tiniest dog with the biggest personality imaginable. He was impossible to train and impossible to get cross with, even when he chewed up my cigarettes on that first morning of our acquaintance. I'm not sure who I fell in love with first, Brian or Dick, but together they were irresistible. Even more irresistible, however, was one of the other boys loafing about the flat. Since I had nowhere else to go, I just stayed until I was caught out on the street a few days later and sent back to Bramerton once more. By which time this lad was officially my new boyfriend, at least in my mind. While we were together, we spent all our time drinking and taking drugs, which suited me fine, and the moment we were parted, I pined like any lovesick teenager. I believed I'd found someone who loved me, and I was high on having Dad proved wrong again. Eager to get back to my new love, I escaped from Bramerton again, as soon as I possibly could. But when I arrived at the flat, I discovered my wonderful new boyfriend had grown tired of waiting, and was already going with another girl, which left me devastated as usual, convinced yet again that Dad had been right, after all, and that no man would ever want me for anything except easy sex. In my despair, I turned to Brian for comfort, and his gentle wisdom and kindness overwhelmed me. I realised I'd just picked the wrong man. Brian, I decided, was the one for me. He wasn't much younger than Dad. Maybe it was a father figure I'd been craving all along, when I tried to get all those poor frustrated schoolboys to declare their undying devotion. As I got to know him better, I found out more about Brian's history. He told me how his dad had beaten him about when he was a kid and had ended up running off with a prostitute. A blow, Brian said, that his devoutly Catholic mother had never really recovered from. His brother and sister had gone on to lead quite straight lives, not like Brian. He had tried to be like them. He even built up his own decorating business, got married and bought a house. But one day he realised he didn't want any of it, that he craved instead to be a free spirit in the world, an easy rider. He became a bit of a rebel and gave everything up to have an affair with another girl, which lasted for 7 years. The girl kept having miscarriages, which had put a terrible strain on the relationship until eventually they broke up and Brian started drinking heavily. He still did drink, but he wasn't a nasty drunk like Dad, more like a benevolent one. Nothing seemed to bother Brian much. He was just a lovely, gentle person, easy to be with, philosophical about life's up and downs, and happy in his own skin. When you were with him, nothing was ever a problem or a rush. By that time, I had also discovered that 2 of the girls who had been on the flat on the first day I arrived were on the game too. So it didn't come as a shock to Brian to find out all about what I did for a living. I found I could talk to him about anything, telling him all about Dad and why I kept running away from Bramerton. He had problems of his own, being an alcoholic, but he never let that get him down, and they seemed to make him more open and tolerant of other people's mistakes and shortcomings. He had none of Dad's bitterness or anger or need to manipulate and control those around him. We took a lot of magic mushrooms and speed together. Speed in particular made me very happy and confident, but it was expensive and meant that I had to stay on the game in order to have the cash to buy it. I was soon taken up to £1 a day, which is a pretty heavy habit for anyone, let alone a 15-year-old. Speed would keep me high for hours, but the come down was always horrendous, making me immediately want more. For every hour that I felt great, there were 3 or 4 hours when I felt like shit. I guess it was just luck that I didn't end up becoming dependent on it like so many of the other girls on the street. It also curbs your appetite, which I thought would help me lose weight. But at the same time, it rots your gums and produces all sorts of other horrible side effects. I'd seen all these symptoms in other people, but I didn't care. I hated myself and my body anyway, so why would I care if I was risking destroying it? I used to take the speed in my drinks or wrap it in paper and swallow it. My dealer told me I would save money by moving on to cocaine, because then I would get the same high with less powder. But I knew that would be one step further on the slippery downward slope and stuck with the drugs I knew. I guess I must have had some sense of self-preservation deep down. In fact, I found out later that he was lying because cocaine would have ended up costing me much more. Thankfully, I never got into heroin, which was less freely available and more expensive in those days than it is now. I was always aware that the feelings the drugs gave me were false, that if I couldn't be happy just because the sun was shining and because I was who I was, then there was something more fundamentally wrong with me than any drugs could ever hope to put right. But I had no idea what I should do about it, or who I should turn to for help, apart from Brian. It was all about escaping from who I was and how I felt, at least for those short periods when I was high. At one stage, I even tried sniffing amyl nitrate, which is a deeply scary drug that makes your heart race seconds after you take it. But I didn't rate the effect of that very highly. I didn't want to be a prostitute then any more than I had done the first night that Dad had held me down for Pete to have his way. But I'd grown used to the whole routine of it by then, particularly the easy money, and I couldn't work out how to survive financially without it. What sort of job could I have done that would have given me anything like enough money to buy the drink and drugs I needed to keep me from thinking about the reality of my life and from wanting to kill myself? I wonder if there's anything in life that you can't grow accustomed to eventually. I knew it was dangerous to be climbing into cars with strange men and that I was risking my life every time I did it, but I didn't care. When you have no love or respect for yourself, the thought that you might die doesn't worry you. Just as every time I dropped a tub of acid, I knew that it might be the one to kill me. I would just shrug the dangers off, thinking that an accidental death might save me having to go to the effort of killing myself in any more gruesome way. I got on really well with other 2 girls in Brian's house, and sometimes we would go up the block to work together. One afternoon, one of them was walking with me when a guy approached us, telling us how beautiful we were and how we should do some modelling. Given how fat and ugly I always believed I was, his words easily worked their magic. It sounded like a laugh, so we went to the address he gave us and had some pictures taken, behaving like 2 silly, vain teenage girls. He asked if we would be willing to do some shots just in our underwear. And because he was being very sweet and flattering, we agreed. "Wow, you can make a fortune," he enthused as he kept snapping away, encouraging us to touch one another in a fairly innocent sort of way. "That's as far as we go," we told him once we'd had enough. "I've just got to show these to my man," he said as we were leaving, "and maybe I can sell them. Come back tomorrow and perhaps we can do some more pictures and draw up a contract." Flattered and excited and eager to believe that we'd found an easy path to fame and fortune, we went back the next day and he said he needed to take a few more pictures. "What about all this money we're talking about?" we wanted to know, "and the contract?" "We need to see a few more photos," he said. "Just slip your bras off." That's when we came to our senses and realised we were giving it away for free, just like Dad was always saying. Deciding it had gone far enough, we ignored his protestations and left. He suddenly seemed like any other punter who didn't want to pay for the kicks. I often wonder what happened to those pictures and whether they'll turn up on the internet one day. Despite our youth, we were both experienced prostitutes, used to dealing with scumbags like Dad. So I would imagine that millions of more innocent young girls must fall for that sort of scam every day and end up being talked into doing things they really don't want to do and later regret. The world is full of predators, eager to exploit the inexperience of people who are still children, really, even if they look like adults. I loved being with Brian, absolutely loved it. He was my first real boyfriend, and he introduced me to a whole new world. There was the music of people like Bruce Springsteen, Meat Loaf, and Bob Seger to start with. He used to play Springsteen's Hungry Heart over and over again on the pub jukebox, just as Dad used to play Charlie Rich. He seemed the most beautiful song in the world to me, and lines like took a wrong turn and just kept going and ain't nobody wants to be alone seemed so apt for the lives we were living. Good rock music, like drink and drugs, allows dreamers like Brian to escape just a little from the mundane realities of their lives and imagine they are the free spirits they've always wanted to be. Brian never had to work at being the centre of attention when he was in a pub, as Dad did. People just automatically gravitated towards him because he was good, kind, laid-back man who treated everyone the same. I convinced myself I was deeply in love, and even though I was still only 15, I managed to persuade a tattoo parlour to engrave Property of Brian on my upper arm, above Dad's name. I was eager to truly belong to someone, especially someone like Brian who would love me and be kind to me and protect me, rather than someone like Dad who just wanted to use and exploit me. Sometimes I would bump into Dad on the street when I was waiting for punters on the block, and it always freaked me out. He was utterly furious that I was working independently of him, and that I had switched my loyalties from him to Brian, and I was scared of what he might do to me. When I was feeling brave, I told myself there wasn't much he could do unless he was willing to beat me up on the street in front of everyone or drag me back home with him, which wouldn't have been too good for his image as a caring single father, struggling to do the best for his broken family. As he saw it, he'd invested time in me, waiting for me to be old enough to provide a return, and now I wasn't paying my dues to him. He'd planned for me to provide him with a free meal ticket for years, just as he had with Mum, and he guessed he thought I'd let him down exactly like she had. Knowing I had Brian to go back to made me brave enough to stand up to Dad a bit. As long as he couldn't get me home or on my own, I felt I was reasonably safe, but you never knew with him. I was always aware there was a danger that he might come lurching out of the pub one night all liquored up and looking for a fight. Brian knew all about him and what he'd done to me, and I knew he would stand up for me if I asked him to. But I was constantly aware that Dad could pounce at any time when I was on my own. I had known him beat up enough people in my life, including me, to be sure that he was capable of anything when his pride, reputation and financial interests were threatened. Funnily enough, although there's no question that he hated Brian, Dad never tried to attack him physically. Probably he wasn't confident that he would come off the best. Although he was 20 years older than me, I don't doubt for a minute that Brian loved me. He always wanted to protect and look after me, and we had a wonderful time together. There was a pub we used to go to all the time, where the landlady knew all about us. She was aware how young I was, but was still willing to serve me as much vodka as I could drink. On the day that Brian and I bought a silver ring down the market and announced we were getting engaged, she and everyone else in the bar were delighted. I was ecstatic, of course. Thought I was getting the one thing I'd always wanted, a proper family, someone who loved me, who I could rely on. I'd spend some time with Brian, and then I'd get caught and taken back to Brampton. But I'd always try to escape again as soon as I could and return to him. I was still only 15, so social services decided that Brampton wasn't able to hold me, and I should be sent to a secure unit in Peterborough called Salter's Lodge. They couldn't put me in prison because I hadn't actually committed any crimes, but they had to do something to show me they were protecting me from myself and from those around me who they saw as dangerous predators. I was terrified, having been told all sorts of stories about secure units by other kids and how they would put me in a straitjacket if I caused any trouble. When I arrived at Salter's Lodge on Friday, the staff told me they didn't have a bed ready in the secure unit until the Monday, so they was going to have to put me in another section, which was a sort of halfway house, a bit like Brampton, until they were ready to transfer me. What that meant was that I had a weekend in which to get away, or I would have been effectively trapped behind bars for as long as they wanted to keep me there. I could see the main building from where I was housed, and to my eyes it looked exactly like an adult prison. I enjoyed my life with Brian too much to be willing to be locked away in there without a fight, but I said nothing, just watching and waiting for my chance. That weekend the staff were taking all the children from the halfway house out to Skegness to go roller skating. One of us is going to have to stay here with you all evening, they told me grumpily, because you can't be trusted, which has really pissed us off because we'd all like to go. That's not my fault, I retorted. It's your job. It's what you get paid for. It's up to you whether you trust me or not. If we could trust you, they wielded, you could come with us. Well, I said as reasonably as I could manage, how are you ever going to learn to trust me if you don't give me a chance? For some bizarre reason, they believed me, despite my record for running away at every opportunity, and agreed to take me with them. They must have really wanted that night out. The moment we arrived in Skegness, they all got into the holiday spirit and seemed to forget that I was famous for absconding and needed to be watched every second of the day. I simply wandered off the moment their backs were turned, hitchhiked back to Norwich, and went straight to Brian's flat. The police came looking for me early the following morning, banging on the front door while Brian lowered me out of the first floor window at the back. I legged it down the road and met up with them again once the police had searched the flat and gone away empty-handed. Whenever I was with Brian, life seemed like one big, hilarious adventure. But there was a serious edge to our escape plans this time, because I really didn't want to be caught and incarcerated in Salter's Lodge. Brian wanted me to be with him as much as I wanted to be with him. He believed that social services were letting me down, and that I needed to be got away from Norwich and away from the danger of Dad getting his hands on me. So we decided to run away together. The plan was that we would hitch down to London and Brian would find work as a painter and decorator to support us until I was old enough for us to return to Norwich and live legally as a couple. I was so flattered that he would be willing to do such a thing for me that I didn't stop to think about the practicalities of the trip. He had a very comfortable life in Norwich, and yet he was willing to give it up and run off with a 15-year-old girl, risking getting into trouble himself in the process. No one had ever offered to do anything like that for me in the past. Why would I hesitate for even a second before putting my fate into his hands?